All right, sweet. Let's give us a sync. Great. Welcome to the Monkey Dance Podcast. This is Ohan. And today is actually an anniversary episode. This is our first year. So thank you everybody who's been listening and sharing it and also commenting because that means a lot. And we also have a guest who is a good friend, collaborator, and also co-author because we do have a paper out together.
Oh, yeah,
this is Thomas.
Yeah. My name is Thomas Ganzetti. Nice being here. Thank you so much for inviting me, Ohan.
Yeah, right on.
I look forward to our session. As Ohan was saying, we are collaborators here at CU. I am a doctoral researcher at the Coxsci department, and I'm doing some research on emotions.
Yeah, right on. And as a co-host today, we have returning Xueyi.
Hello, this is Xueyi. I see, and I'm back.
And why don't you tell us more about what you do?
Okay, sure. So basically what I try to study, to investigate, is how others' emotions and others' emotional displays can help us in social learning, especially when we're facing very uncertain and unfamiliar situations. And on top of that, I also collaborate on a project which is funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation, which tries to understand how also kids during development start to use emotional cues to make sense of their environments. So this project, it's actually both with adults and with kids, and we try to understand how cultural learning is possible without communication.
Yeah, right on. And how does emotion actually play a role in this?
Here, the idea is that, of course, there are many different ways we can learn about our cultural world. I want to keep it simple. If you go somewhere, of course, people can tell you, oh, this is the rule here, or you're supposed to use this object in this way, or you continuously learn through others. But others also have spontaneous reactions that are not intentional, right? I am just here with you, and you see something that is dirty in the corner, and you suddenly have a very negative display, and I understand that's not okay. But I do it immediately. I don't need a higher level processing for that. I just recognize your emotion. I don't even have to represent what's in your mind and understand it's something that is not supposed to happen. So we call this deontic marker with Fabrice Clément from Neuchâtel. And we try to understand how kids are able to detect emotions, recognize them, and use them to modulate their behavior. So this can have also sort of emotional contagion in the observer, for sure. But it's not necessary in a sense, because in the moment in which you recognize the valence of the emotion, you make an association. So it would be a form of associative learning, and you're able to understand that that can lead to punishment or negative consequences or loss of reputation or gain of reputation within a community. So this would be...
Yeah, and so I think it's probably pretty clear, but why deontic marker then? Like why the specific focus on the deontic aspect of it?
The deontic aspect is is very interesting because the idea is that you can learn about rules in the environment, about patterns. This is actually a little bit more complex because it's related to the notion of a social script. Many people are not maybe familiar with it, but the idea is that we don't have to constantly represent the world and to understand what's going on in the mind of others, to understand what socially is going to happen. I make a concrete example maybe. Let's say you go to the supermarket, right? And you're buying cherry tomatoes and you're going to the counter. And it's not that you, in that moment, start to represent the cashier's state of mind, like, okay, I'm going to put the tomatoes, she's going to know that I'm going to buy the tomatoes, then I'm going to give my card, she's going to think that I have money on the card, so all the transaction will go that way. It's more like, put tomatoes on the counter, I pay, I go. I know that the cashier is going to do what they are supposed to do. That's a social role. This is a social script. I don't understand any more effort in my cognitive processing. I just do it. But if this is violated, if I see them behaving weird or displaying an emotion, then I start to mentalize, I start to represent their mind, I start to understand what is going on, why the social script is not going as it is supposed to go. And I think emotions are markers in the sense that can help us to understand the expectations we can have about the environment. So maybe first time I observe the emotion, I mark the situation, like this is good, this is bad, this is weird. Of course, there are many, it's more complex than this, right? The range of emotions is incredible, especially all these social, cultural emotions, contempt, prestige, all these things can trigger a lot. But the idea is that they mark the situation and then you can form a script that you use that you generalize to all those situations in the future.
Yeah, I like the script concept because it also fits well with how I see things in terms of predictive models. and the main thing that we experience or pay attention to is things that violate the expectation, right? Which in this case, the emotion would. So is the core interest for you the transmission of information, like the communicative aspect, and emotion is just a very salient one, so that's why you study it? Or is it that you're studying emotion and you realize that it's a good communication, so you ended up studying this aspect of emotion?
Actually, I ended up studying this because I started to learn to study how we filter information coming from the environment. And at some point, we were running a study on non-verbal cues. So people like making assent, like you shake your head or you nod. And that is a form of epistemic communication because it still conveys like, oh, this is right or this is wrong, basically. But it has also a little affective component, right? Because it's facial expression. When you nod, you tend to smile, like you're agreeing. And this gives direct information to the observer. But that is a case in which you are actively observing someone who wants to convey you something. So this is ostensive communication, it's called, right? Intentional communication. But what if you see others just spontaneously doing that without intention? So yes, I'm interested in transmission of information, but not in relation to direct communication, more in a spontaneous observation of others without being engaged in direct interaction with them. Because it's very interesting from a cultural and from an evolutionary point of view.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to ask. If it started out with how we got here, because it seems like the study of nonverbal communication to me is really interesting because it helps lay the foundation of how societies were built, so pre-language. So this is an interesting part for you. Okay, right on.
And then I'm wondering, are you only focusing on emotion as a factor, as a marker, or how do you see its in relationship with other factors? Because, for example, the use of language.
Yeah.
So I don't know if are you going to working on it, or it's just one of the aspects which you explain what you have found in your research.
Yeah, I mean that's a great point. Of course, I see this as a continuum. Right, these are not things that I want to separate. My idea is now to focus on non-verbal communication, so to keep language out of the picture for a while, just because this is a way of investigating some origin of cultural transmission. I had many conversations about this, and I would be interested in also seeing how you can use emotion in language later. But that is like a second step for me. Like I think what might have happened at the very beginning of cultural transmission is that you would just observe spontaneous reactions of people and you would form this association, like this marker. But then you also have the need to convey that to other people. And you start to use intentional communication. Maybe just with this, I just look at you and then I look at the target and I make another emotional display. And that's a form of proto-communication because I'm not using language, right? But I am indicating and signaling to you that you should pay attention to that. And this type of ostensive communication, right, is supposed to create an anticipation of relevance in the observer. So basically, I'm looking at you, so I'm directing your attention towards something. So since I'm doing it, you expect the information I want to convey to you to be extremely relevant because I'm telling you, oh, there is something I want to tell you, right? And then I look at something and say, oh, that's bad, without saying that, but just making like a disgusting face or something. And then, I think language is a further step into this process. And I can also verbally explaining why that's bad, why that's good, or maybe that's just for me, or maybe you might like it. Like food, I think would be a very interesting topic of research.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I've been reading something about language and emotion. For example, people say that individuals have specific certain vocabulary concerning emotions are better able to categorize or differentiate emotions. So basically, there's some argument that a language could shape our emotion perception. So it's not really what you said that I verbally explain things post hoc, but it's like language is like a window for us to perceive or observe our emotionally more efficiently. It's like an optional but efficient tool. So how would do you have any comment or?
I totally, agree with you. As the literally indicates, the more you're able to describe your emotions, the better you can categorize them, the better you can detect them. Of course, this is a very strong component. Then, it's also true that there are many debates regarding the existence of discrete originary emotions, like the 6 basic emotions, then became 8, then 10, then 12. Because there are so many different shades even within the same emotion. And also now current theories say we don't have basic emotions at all, and all emotions come from cognitive processes. And there is like this overlap of different neural networks that are related to attention and to other cognitive abilities that produce emotional states. And in that sense, language, of course, would be even more intrinsically related to the recognition of these emotions, because it would be even more fluid, this interpretation of emotions. But I don't think the two ideas are necessarily incompatible, because I think we might have had some primary networks for some discrete emotions, but then during our long evolution and during our long social and cultural history, probably we develop way more social, cultural emotions, and also through like a sort of co-evolution of the two. Like the more I can also represent and talk about my emotions, the more emotions I discover that I feel like I categorize them. But it's true that even animals have some emotions, right? And I don't think they do. They don't have language, most of them. They have some forms of communication, but if they display fear or anger, or they signal something like in hierarchy in the group, they're still doing it. So this for me is very important, because it means that some basic valence is still there. And that is what interests me. But what you say is, yeah, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I usually take things as being positive and negatively valenced, and see the entire fleshed out sort of field of emotion as something that is contingent upon language, and also really complex social interaction, which maybe we didn't have earlier on, but it was necessary to be able to parse out whether something is threatening or not.
Yeah,
and I think that's a really fun aspect. So when you talk about ostensive communication, do you think about theory of mind at all? Do you take that as a necessary component? Do you ignore it?
I have a complex relationship with theory of mind, in the
likewise.
sense, of course, we do have theory of mind. Of course, we are good and bad at theory of mind, depending on what we are actually doing. I just say that I don't agree. I mean, I don't buy totally mentalization as the core of social life. There are many theories saying we always represent the others. Theory of mind is what is really differentiating us from any other animal on the planet. I tend to disagree with this, because I think it's very expensive in terms of cognitive processing. There are many studies showing that we are good, but not that good at representing other perspectives. So I think we use it only when it's strictly necessary or for specific tasks. But I like the idea of developing a framework of social and cultural learning, which doesn't depend fully and entirely on the ability to mind reading and to represent others' mental states. So, of course, in ostensive communication, I think there is a theory of mind component, to the extent that I at least represent your intention to communicate something to me. But it could be also more basic, right? I could be just an attention getter. By default, I evolved that when I detect direct gaze from you, like eye contact, I create an anticipation of relevance. I mean, but this is an open debate. To be honest, I'm not the expert on ostensive communication. I am working more on the origin of affective communication, which is different, but that's a very interesting debate for sure.
Yeah, you and I have the same view on this, which is that we don't necessarily need to constantly be representing every aspect of our environment. It would be incredibly expensive metabolically, right? And it's much easier to take humans as highly information dense aspects of our environment, which then respond and correspond to a lot of our behavior. So that's also good to hear. And what do you take then about automatic displays of emotion as well? So when I'm not trying to ostensibly communicate, but sort of the emergence of a display of emotion which I don't intend to communicate, but might do just because I feel something in the moment.
Yeah, that's the most interesting case for me, right? Because if I am able to use that emotion, I mean, here the idea is simple. We said when there is intentional communication, I create an anticipation of relevance. I have an anticipation of relevance. So the information that is supposed to increase my tendency to learn, my tendency to acquire the information. What we are trying to demonstrate is that emotional displays, even the case that you just mentioned, so when they're completely spontaneous and automatic, they are so important from an evolutionary perspective that they trigger the same tendency to learn. So if I see someone reacting, even spontaneously and automatically, I know that that is very important information about the environment because it is an emotional display. And our sensors used to learn through emotions all the time. So I will tend to understand what's going on, why there is this emotion in the display, and I will be more likely to use this information to make predictions about the environment. So this would be like an alternative to explaining all the evolution of our society and culture through communication, direct communication, and to say, okay, there is an alternative route to cultural learning, observing others emotional displays, even if they don't want to convey anything to us. They're doing it. So that is very relevant information, right?
Yeah, that makes sense in terms of the person receiving the information, right? And that it's evolutionarily beneficial if you can understand the displays of your conspecifics in your environment. And that makes me think, do you think of the actual emergence of the displayer, not of the person observing, as something like a communal intelligence that might co-evolve, right? Because if we can all effectively display our emotional states to one another without even thinking about it, that it might increase the survival rate of our community as a whole. Because if I can effectively communicate information without words immediately when I see a threat, that is more effective for both of you, right? As well as myself, because my survival is contingent upon your survival, but then also your ability to recognize that influences it. So do you think that the actual emergence of the display is not just the recognition, is a part of this?
Yes, in the sense that, there are many theories that saying that we tend to display emotions more when we are around others, even unintentionally. This, I think, is a very interesting point, because even if I just slightly exaggerate my emotional display, what's the purpose? The purpose is for others to recognize it, even if I don't mean to do it. So I think that emotions are social. I think that emotions have this component, and I think we want others to recognize them most of the time, because then sometimes it's better to hide emotions too. Sometimes we try to deceive others through emotions. There are many studies on this. For example, I'm going to collaborate with new people in January, and they were doing some studies showing how display of regret after making a selfish economic choice in an economic setting basically fosters trust from the other person in following trials. Meaning that, okay, I take everything is on the plate, but then I show regret. The other is more likely to trust me again rather than I am satisfied about it. And this can be, of course, used to deceive others, but also to maximize your benefit in that moment, and then to still, be social in a sense, because then you still want to play the game with the other as partners and cooperators. So these are very interesting points, I think.
Yeah, that's quite a good point, in that we are aware of the fact that people are constantly observing us, so we can actually use it to manipulate others as well. And I guess one of the things I think about immediately is something like people laughing a lot more when there are friends around if they hear something funny, right? And I think that there's something communal about co-displays of emotion that breeds some kind of familiarity, whether it's mutual displays of disgust or mutual displays of enjoyment. I think there's probably something there that we're able to share in. And we also...
No, continue. I have a funny, interesting question here.
Oh, go for it.
Okay, so I was thinking, let's say we tend to display or experience, I don't know if it's a correct argument, stronger emotions when we are in an in-group situation with our friends or people who are like us. And then I was thinking, then we can build a system, like emotion system, like this way. I look away means something's happening, and then you quickly catch this message. But does this system, I was concerned that this system could could not benefit this inclusivity. So, for example, if in a group of people, they have their own system to display emotion without explicitly communicate with each other without language, then I feel a bit excluded in that situation. So it's also, I don't know if it's relevant to what you say, that they use emotion as a way to manipulate people. But in the situation I just mentioned, that it's a way to socially exclude people who are not in your group. So it's just an example that I feel like it could be like the way we use emotion or the way we communicate our emotions.
Yeah. There's a strong cultural component to the development of emotion, right?
Yeah.
And if you're not part of that culture, then you can misinterpret or be intentionally excluded.
Yeah.
I think there are intentional aspects to this, and also sometimes unintentional aspects where we assume that something is a universal, but is actually very culturally specific of how to even display gratitude. I think that's a big one, of how to display like warmth and reception, like how to play a good host, and also how to display gratitude. I think these things change a lot. How we also communicate disagreement. This happens a lot for me in my household, and a lot of Armenians, Levantines in general, argue very passionately, but there's no like love lost. It's not aggressive. It's not seen as aggressive. It's just seen as an impassioned. It's just the way to do it.
Yeah.
But if I argue with a lot of Europeans or even like Americans with non-immigrant backgrounds, they might think that I'm angry about something, but that's just how we argue. That's just how we discuss. It's not even an argument. That's just how we discuss. Yeah. So maybe, are there things that you experience like that as well?
Yeah, I think so. Because, it's just a cue for me to kind of understand what's going on around me and then trying to predict what's going on. Like I have this script or schema in my mind. And emotion, I understand it as a marker, which to see correct this schema or kind of extend this schema. And it's reinforced the schema in my mind. Mm-hmm. And I have this experience, definitely.
I think she used the word script, right?
You said check the right boxes. yeah, that makes sense. So then there's a project that you and I are working on together. It's slowly making progress of how early on we basically take emotions as deontic cues. Do you want to sort of explain your set of interests in that experiment, or explain the experiment and explain your interest?
Yeah, the one we're currently working on. Yeah, sure. I mean, the idea is to investigate how young children, so we're talking about since 3 years old, they can use two types of cues. So on one side, we have emotional cues, right? So emotional displays, very simple ones like positive, a smile or an angry face, with the eyebrows and everything there. And the question is, does it matter who is displaying the emotion? So let's say in this experiment, we want kids to understand if a machine is working. The goal of the machine is to turn on a light bulb. And they don't know how to do it. Like the machine is full of levers and little buttons. It's a very complex machine. But they see two little monsters. This is set in Monsters Village. I mean, it's very engaging. And there are two monsters, a yellow one and a blue one. They have different names. And they show whether they know how to turn on the machine or not, basically. So they demonstrate their accuracy. They demonstrate their competence. So there is a competent individual who always turns on the machine, turns on the light. There is an incompetent one. And then basically there are new monsters trying to operate the machine. And the kids don't see if the machine is going to work or not. They have to guess. And the only cue they have is that in the background there are the two initial monsters, the competent one and the incompetent one, showing conflicting emotional displays. So one of them is happy about how the other monster is operating the machine. The other one is angry at like negative display about the other monster is operating the machine. So here the idea is that as adults, what we would do is trusting the guy who is competent. If the guy who is competent is happy, well, the light is likely to turn on. But we don't know if this is going to happen with very young kids, because it's also possible that some emotions are just more relevant than others. Negative displays, from a survival point of view, they were crucial. Seeing someone reacting negatively, it was an anticipation of punishment. In terms of observational learning, in fear, even more, maybe. There are many studies on observational fear learning. It's a very interesting topic. So they could just prevail. So if I don't manage to make this attribution to who is displaying the emotion, so I don't filter the information coming from the environment, I just go maybe with the negative emotion catches more of my attention, and I could just rely on that one most of the time. Or other hypothesis, right? We are talking, this is an empirical question, so these are not answers, these are just ideas. Smiles are also very important, right? People prefer people who smile. People tend to prefer people who display positive emotions. And this could indicate a preference for the character who is displaying the positive emotion, independently of their competence. So it's interesting to see how, throughout development, kids start to differentiate between this type of cues, start to attribute traits to the expressors, and how this influences the perception and the use of the emotional displays of these characters. It sounds easy. It's not easy at all from a cognitive point of view. And we don't know what we are going to find with very young kids, but we expect definitely, at least at 5-6 years of age, an adult-like use of emotional displays, because they get better at theory of mind, they get better at attributing traits to others, but it's very interesting. We're going to test next month, so I hope we'll have the chance to discuss the findings together. But
yeah, you'll have to come back in 6 months when you're back.
Yeah.
But yeah, so the interesting thing is kind of starting with 3 years old. And there's this interesting thing where when you look at infants, a lot of the infants are fearless because they haven't yet understood what to fear. Even this theory of the innate fear of snakes kind of breaks down when you look at infants who, if you put them around snakes, they're perfectly fine. So there are some good studies where infants are fearless around snakes because if their caregivers are displaying positive cues, then they're like, this thing is fine. And it's only at a certain age when children start developing fear of strange objects, probably because that comes about because they're not close enough to their caregiver. They need to be more scared of everything rather than fearless. And I guess one of the things for me that I'm really curious to see is whether 3, my guess is yes, but whether 3 is old enough to start developing that avoid reaction, which is common once toddlers really start generating enough space from their caregivers. In the absence of a positive cue or a negative cue from the caregiver, I think that children will automatically default to avoid, which is why children start getting very shy at a certain age, shy of other people, shy of other things, other animals, why insects become more scary to 3-year-olds than to an infant who might just pick it up and eat it.
Yeah, I think that there is also another important indication from the literature. Like there are some studies showing is emotional eavesdropping, right? Basically, it's the moment in which you are not directly engaged in interaction with others, but you see some emotional reactions, and you can use this information to learn about the environment. And these studies with, I think they were 2 years old, probably. I don't remember. Maybe I'm getting it wrong, but around that age. And it was about unfamiliar objects. So some unfamiliar objects were receiving some negative valence, and some of them positive valence or neutral valence. What's actually interesting that there is sometimes not a direct avoidance of the object that is negatively balanced, because sometimes they want to explore their environment. And they're like, why is this really like that? And also, if they saw someone else like receiving like a negative display because they chose that object, they were playing with that object, I think they feel they are granted a free trial, you know. So sometimes what they do is that they actually choose that one to see the reactions of others, to make sure that people are reacting negatively for the use of that object and maybe not to some. I'm just speculating, right? But if you look at the data, they tend to do it. They tend to go with a negative object and to test their prediction. So this is very interesting. That was also a very safe environment, of course. Usually there are also caregivers. So, I mean, they feel that they're in a safe environment, of course. It would be interesting. It's not possible to do it, of course, but to imagine a scenario in which it could be a real threat. And then I think also our natural response at a very young age would be kind of different, because I don't think that it would be the case. But we learn very often in this type of safe environment, right? So it's interesting to see how we acquire cultural ways of doing, also by testing to which extent we can push others before they get pissed off, maybe.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And maybe this is a good time to cut into the experiments that you did, basically showing a very similar thing with adults.
Yes. So first, we ran a couple of studies during the last year, and they are about affective observation, which is basically this emotional eavesdropping, seeing someone else reacting to something, and I'm not involved in the interaction at all. In this specific case, we focus on action performances, instrumental action performances, so how you combine the use of two objects to obtain a certain outcome, because technical knowledge is, an essential part of our culture. And it seemed very easy also to manipulate it to produce familiar or unfamiliar end states. So we had two sets of actions. So people were seeing action performances either involving familiar objects performing a familiar action. I'm making an example: peeling potatoes, cutting something, using scissors, stuff like this. So you know why the action is performed in the first place. It's a successful outcome. It's efficient, and blah blah. On the other side, we had objects used in an unfamiliar way. So putting a stick inside of a balloon, and this is what is called in the literature cultural opaqueness. It's opaque because you don't really understand the goal of the action, why it is performed in that way. Of course, none of the actions were involved in breaking the objects or violating their properties, because we didn't want to associate with a negative valence. But you're like, okay, why are they doing it? There might be a reason, there might not be a reason. And many cultural rituals and actions that we see performed, like if you think, I don't know, in Morocco when they pour green tea and you don't really know why they're doing that. It's cool. Everybody does it like that. You associate it with that, but you don't know how. And you know why it's done in that way. So the idea is to have unfamiliar outcomes. So to make a summary of the study, we have these two sets of actions. Participants were seeing either negative, positive, or neutral reactions to these actions, and then they were asked to predict a new observer's reaction. And the idea was, when the reaction is violating my prior expectation, so if there is a familiar action that I know is performed in a correct way, and there is, for example, a negative reaction, I'm less likely to expect everybody to react negatively to that, because I know I have prior knowledge, right? That action is not supposed to trigger anything negative. Maybe that guy is weird. Maybe he's mad at the guy performing the action. You attribute the emotion to something else. On the other side, unfamiliar actions, you have no knowledge about them. You don't know how to evaluate them. So the idea is that, especially in uncertain and ambiguous situations, you rely on emotional displays way more to make your predictions about the environment. And this is exactly what we found and replicated in 8 different experiments. So basically, people use others' emotions to predict new observers' reactions to unfamiliar actions, but not to familiar ones. So lack of familiarity with the context, with the learning context, increases the use and the reliance on emotional displays. So this was a very interesting finding. And then we were asking ourselves, but in this scenario, we were using pictures from a database. Of course, it was many, many trials because we wanted to show its automatic processing. People had only 2 seconds to see the reaction and then to make their predictions. It was very, very fast. And we're like, but maybe some of the pictures we used, they were facing the participant. These pictures from the databases, they're like, oh, but this is kind of eye contact. Might it be that then this might be explained with communication and anticipation of relevance that we were discussing? So we ran another set of experiments in which we manipulated exactly the extent of intentional communication from the observer. So we had direct eye contact or averted gaze. We had also with little clouds, like comic clouds, saying, oh, look, that's good. Oh, look, that's bad. And we showed statistically there was no significant difference. So our findings were not explained by the use of intentional communication. Even without intentional communication, people still generalize. This is the name for it, generalized information. Generalization just basically means that you attribute the same evaluation to multiple individuals in a social group. And this is very important for cultural transmission because it's basically from one observation you can extend culturally shared values to an entire community. And that is what allows you to make predictions about how you're supposed to behave, what are the rules in the community to coordinate with others. That is the most important thing that our brain can do, because you can go from one to everything in like one snap. So it's a very incredible thing. And we show that even with averted gaze, people tend to do it consistently, especially for negative emotions. As I was saying, it seems to be even more relevant. And so it was very cool, yes.
Yeah, that was great. So just to clarify, when you had the individuals displaying the emotional cue, you had no difference between when they were gazing at the participant, when they were gazing to the side, and then when you had, instead of a person displaying a cue, like a language cue displaying, explaining the emotion.
Yeah. The third condition, the verbal communication one, was picture with direct eye contact plus comic cloud with verbal.
Oh, right.
Verbal cue. So it was combination. It was the strongest because we wanted to put, because we were like, at some point, if it is true that generalization depends exclusively on intentional communication, we should find an effect. We didn't. And this is very interesting because for all conditions, we found generalization, right? So theories saying that communication is crucial, they are right. We replicated their findings, okay? But we extend them to situations in which there is not ostensive and intentional communication. Is what we were discussing in the beginning. An alternative, primitive route, maybe, a foundational layer of cultural learning. It could be affective observation. If you think about it, why not? Learning by observing others without engaging directly with them is safer, it's less effortful, it doesn't require theory of mind. It's basically automatic and instantaneous. Amazing, no?
Yeah, I mean, it hits on a really important question, which is how we, as humans, both splintered into small groups and then also globalized so fast. Because you can show up in a novel environment and assess your own behavior based on the reactions of individuals who are native to that place. And I think that type of cultural transmission without language is crucial, even for being able to teach one another a language before there was anything like the printed book, right? Is just to be able to display and bootstrap on top of the existing language you have based on the emotional cues, and then obviously the sort of ostensive pointing gestures and things like that, what kind of linguistic structure the people that you're communicating with have. So that it's a really interesting thing to have demonstrated that while the language is incredibly efficient, there is, for more complex sets of communication, when you're talking about base level valence communication, maybe even the most efficient is a display rather than language, which is why we would display something rather than speak if it's an immediate situation.
Yeah, just to say, I'm not against the idea of having language explaining a lot of our cultural systems and values in our cultural systems. Of course, through language, you can get to, as Isu was saying, understanding of also these values, because you can categorize them, represent them, detect them. You can make order out of what you observed also. But what is interesting here is that the first step could rely on something else and something very automatic. And why is this so interesting? Because it can extend also to other species. Why cannot non-human primates also maybe have something like this? And there are many studies, especially in the last years, because this is a hot topic only in the last 10 years, I would say, on affective social learning in chimpanzees or in bonobos. And they find something. I mean, they use empathy. They use emotional displays to coordinate with other group members. Of course, it is a form of communication, but then it gets a very philosophical debate about what we mean about communicating, intention, mind reading. I'm more simple in this aspect. I mean, I just prefer to look at what is going on, and the fact that just by displaying some emotions, something happens in the group, and something is more likely to be conveyed to others or not. Like tool use exists also in non-human primates, and we recently had a talk from Thibaut Gruber from the University of Geneva, who is a primatologist who is trying to combine, he calls this framework ABC, so affect, behavior, and cognition, to try to merge these things for a better understanding of cultural learning also in non-human primates. And they're finding very interesting stuff. Of course, it's a long journey, it's a long way to really understand what's going on, but something is moving.
Yeah, this is an interesting thing, because what you're able to do is strip the affective component away from emotion and take emotional displays as a behavioral component that the primary use of which is communication. So it doesn't actually help us as an individual for understanding our emotions or even understanding our environment to display a cue, but it does help with socialization, with both learning and helping others to learn. And it turns the affective component very inward to something that more guides our behavior, right? And allows us to rely on something like an intuition, which is effectively like a learned process, which you don't need to actively be aware of as you navigate your environment. You rely on how you feel about a place to guide your behavior. But the displaying aspect is sort of something different there. It's a behavioral tool that helps us navigate our environments, and then potentially even just communicate, co-learn with our conspecifics. So do you take then, when you deal with emotions, it doesn't seem like you're dealing much with the affective component. It seems like you're dealing specifically with emotion as a behavioral display, which is then, it makes a lot of sense in terms of, so if we take chimpanzee grooming, for example, would you take grooming as something like an emotional display? Grooming of others, I mean.
Yeah, that's a tricky question. I mean, yes and no, but then it really depends how we want to conceptualize it. Also, you say that I basically disentangle the affect and the behavioral component of emotional displays. Yeah, but this is a specific take on cultural learning that we're having now with affective observation, which is one of the processes that are involved in using others' emotions to learn. But as I was saying at the beginning, there might be also an emotional contagion component in which the affect component becomes crucial. And also, this is more like on my personal philosophical conceptualization of it, I think one thing is acquiring the values shared in a community, and another one then is understanding ourselves within this community. And also, I think that we are very influenced by what others associate with positive affect, or what is cool, what is not cool. And everybody wants to be cool, especially at a certain stage of development, And you start to represent your own values, and you have this system of beliefs. But are they really beliefs? Because for me, they're affective states. I have associations of things with something that makes me feel valued or cool, or not just for others. I mean, even just for myself, in my self-representation. And this influences how I develop the relationship with myself. I think language for this is very important too. And there are also many ways of expressing yourself that have a very strong connotation, right? Like when you're with your friends, you want to use a word no one knows about and it sounds cool and it's very opaque to others. I mean, you can do it in many ways. But the affective component that I think is very strong, like the affect, because you really feel good or bad about yourself based on a system of values that you develop, but that you acquire through your cultural environment. It would be maybe different if you were in a different cultural environment, but some things, I mean, I don't want to use the word innate, of course, but you're predisposed to be in a certain way. So in a sense, you try to become yourself, but you continually update your system of values, which updates your system of beliefs. And this is a very extremely complicated story, right? But affect there, oh, sure, totally, 100%, way more than any other process for me.
Yeah. That's how I see affect, as a very inward-driven process, as something that sort of guides behavior, is, I would say, evolutionarily programmed in as some kind of like phenomenal incentivization mechanism, right? So what's useful for a system, like any agent within any genotype, is to be able to have a set of affective responses inbuilt that then guide behavior in a particular way. Maybe it's just that there's the framework, not attached to any specific type of information coming in, and that what the learning process is through infancy is what to attach, what kinds of, I would call them beliefs, but what type of reactions, affective states to associate with what types of information coming in. Whether it's, I would say general uncertainty is something that generates a negative affect from the beginning, which is useful for survival. Like an infant feeling any type of discomfort generates one output, cry, which is fundamentally useful for survival, in the same way that, upon hunger, there's, like a sucking mechanism to be able to eat, things like that. But after that, the whole fleshed out ability to not just receive communication from others and feel that internally, like if you feel rejection or something like that, right? But also to be able to generate the displays which are then communicative and not just cry every time you see a negative stimuli. This is something that we grow into and isn't necessarily an innate function. The capacity to learn that is probably innate, but the breadth of it is not innate itself.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I totally agree.
I have a question.
Sure.
It could be very innocent. So basically, I'm thinking about the relationship between emotion and memory.
Yeah.
So something positive happened, and in my script, I mark it as I'm fine. So when I'm in a similar situation, I don't need to be like alert or something. But so maybe we're more focusing on the negative emotional display, which can help us, behave better in the next situation. Then do we encode this negative emotional display more in our working memory or in our memory system? So I'm just curious, what's the relationship here? And yeah.
Okay. I mean, again, I think this is another empirical question, right? I mean, I can guess and tell my perspective on this, but I think when you have something associated with a negative valence, I just also have a clarification question on your question. So when you say in our working memory, what do you mean? Like when, for which task? For the one you learned about? So you're saying every time I re-represent like how to perform a certain action or a certain social situation, in my working memory it's activated this connection to my negative
it's like
valence.
association here.
Yeah, I mean, it could be definitely, but I'm just thinking that there is a lot of encoding of negative situations also in our episodic memory, right? And that is kind of maybe having a secondary influence on how then we plan our behavior. So it could be on both sides. I mean, in a sense, maybe there could be something very automatic also in relation to motor control, for example. Maybe that needs more repetition, right? I don't know if after just one observation you can really... I'm thinking, I don't know, I love to play tennis. If I'm playing tennis with someone who is very good, and I'm just doing my backhand, like, oh no, it's terrible. The ball has to go in the court, not in the wood. Maybe I have to try it a couple of times, and every time I modulate also my responses based on the facial expressions of him. I don't know, maybe I have to try it 10, 15 times, and then I think I create a script for my backhand. I know that I have to do it in that way. A script maybe here is not the best word, but you know what I mean, right? I know that is the best way to go. And I think that once it's fixed, I know that every time I deviate from that, I will have a negative association with it because I know I'm doing it wrong. But now I think we are also talking about something very specific, right? Because we are talking about correctness of my performance, like how correct, how efficient, how performative it is what I'm doing. But something negative could be also the use of a word. If I am here, see you, and I use a homophobic word that I didn't know it was homophobic, and everybody starts looking at me very, very bad. But I hear someone using it, for example, I will avoid it, definitely. But where is it encoded?
Yeah.
Good question.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely have a negativity bias. And one of the crucial aspects of the negativity bias is social negative reactions, right? If I make a joke and people react negatively, I won't make that joke anymore. Or I might, find new friends and, become, vote for Donald Trump or something. Like there's one of two paths. Either you reconcile and stay in the group you're in, or you refuse to reconcile and then join a new group. So I think there's something really interesting there about how, like, the saliency of negative reactions, and then how that drives not only our behavior, but the types of things we remember. And I think rejection is much more salient than something like a celebration. Like, you will remember all the time somebody blamed you for something, then all the time somebody said good job, because good job is a reinforcement of a state that you're already in. Whereas, like you're mentioning, even with the cashier, you will recognize something that generates a certain amount of uncertainty in that it violates the predictions you expect. Right. And I think that that's probably a crucial aspect of something like, again, the emotional displays for group cohesion, but then also for understanding of one's own place in a particular environment. But then also the importance of affective states in guiding our behavior, of actually having a reaction to people's negative displays. Because there are, if you take certain subsegments of the population, I think an interesting two sets of groups here are, say, certain individuals who have autism spectrum, right? who don't necessarily understand the affective displays of others, but ostensibly, of course, have a full range of internal emotion, but don't necessarily display or understand displays as clearly as others. And then on the complete other end of the spectrum, you have psychopathy, right? Individuals who are born psychopathic, which is the inability really to have affective emotional states. So this is both in the recognition of they're able to recognize and display the emotional states without any of the affective component. This goes from internal feelings of disgust or avoidance if they see something as horrific as a mutilated body, for example. They might display something like a negative affective response, but really we're able to physiologically and neurologically monitor that there's almost nothing going on. Whereas if anybody without psychopathy sees it, there's a full range of reactions, even if you're able to keep a straight face. So I think these two cases on opposite ends of the spectrum for different reasons are really interesting for also understanding what the usefulness is of emotions for us in our individual day.
Yes, it's a great point. And in addition to this, I think now we're focusing on specific types of emotions, right? Negative or fear or disgust or rejection of something. But you've met Fabrice Clement. And I was just now thinking, he has this idea, I don't know if he's still working on it, that interest is an emotion. Trying to consider interest as an emotion is very interesting. I know. Yeah, sorry for that. But if we all the time talk about like this anticipation of relevance, of what is relevant, then it's like getting into an emotional state of what is interesting, right? And then many times we talked about this. There is one type of social emotion that he finds very interesting. And I think this goes beyond this recognition of emotions. So even connected to what you were saying, this would be exactly a culture way of using emotions, of driving others' emotions, which is contempt. So let's say you're a kid, you are playing soccer for the first time, you love soccer, and you're so excited, and you go to your father, who is a lawyer, just want to find someone with a great personality, and joking, love for all lawyers, of course. And you're like, oh, dad, I played soccer, it was amazing. And the guy's like, huh. I mean, you see what I mean? It changes completely the evaluation of the kid. So it changed completely the system of value, because maybe he was feeling that it was exciting, but he wants, of course, the approval of the father, and maybe he will change completely what he's going to do. Or maybe we feel less interest for soccer or more, right? But this is very interesting, because just in one moment, you have to re-update your system of beliefs. But are they beliefs? For me, they're your system of emotions. So your system of emotional associations is what I would call it. And you reappraise yourself into this, because if you are really passionate about it, you'll be like, oh, he doesn't understand. But if you rely more on other people, like, oh, maybe this was just stupid. And you stop having interest, and you change completely your emotions about this and about many other things, because this could also influence how you, maybe, I don't know, next time I'm playing some new game, or I'm in a situation I've never been before, I will look more for the emotional display of others around me to make an assessment about the situation. Or even, I don't know, I tell a joke, is it funny or is it not funny? Like self-assessment of values is very important, I think, in development. And how others display emotions towards what we like or we don't like is also very important. So in the future, I also would like to study this interconnection, honestly.
Yeah. In particular, the idea of interest is of particular interest to me, just because of how I deal with people searching for information, right? And I see curiosity, right? I think maybe interest and curiosity are basically the same thing here, where you have something like a desire for more information. You have the belief, or maybe just at the lowest level possible, just a prior, to make it simple, like some kind of prior that's triggered when you engage with information that generates a demand for more information. And I think that that's a really interesting thing, because you can tell when people shift into curiosity, a state of curiosity, right? Or of interest. I'm using them interchangeably here. And that's an interesting thing because again, it's so important to be able to display that, because displaying interest in more information about something, or the exact opposite, like you were mentioning, allows us to understand, again, our place, but then also potentially the usefulness of something, and also even something like the ability to fit in, like what it would take to gain the favor of others. And I don't even think that there's a calculus involved there. I don't think that you need to think, oh, I'm going to do this thing so that these people like me. You can. We can do that. But there's also an automatic process of, oh yeah, you're right, that isn't very cool. Or, oh yeah, this is actually pretty interesting. I didn't realize how interesting it was. And that aspect of it, I think there's an interesting component there of teasing out the times when we're able to reflect on and actively engage in something because we think it will gain us favor, versus the times when somebody is actually guiding or able to guide, maybe it's a mutual process, our interest in something. Like if you have you and your best friend, ideally, if you have something close to a balance of power, are guiding each other's interests rather than them just telling you what to do, or vice versa, right? I think that would be a greater imbalance of power in the friendship if there's a non-automatic process, and if it doesn't go both ways. But if there's a sort of mutual transfer of information, then I would say there's something more equivalent in the power dynamic. Mm-hmm. So there's something interesting here with your experiments, right? Because when you have somebody observing a display based on a novel environment, what they're saying is, like, if I observe somebody else's display, I'm saying, oh, there's somebody who probably is more informed than I am. So in this information dynamic, I cede power to them, right? I give them power in the informational dynamic, and there's sort of a voluntary deference, to use a term Guilherme uses, to understand the situation. I defer to them because I assume that they are more knowledgeable, and I get the information from them. And I think that this is an interesting thing that we do. We can shift from us wanting to be the knowledgeable one in a space to us sharing knowledge, to then us deferring to others who are more knowledgeable.
I tend to disagree with this conclusion, because in my experience, the fact that participants expect novel individuals to react in the same way and to share the value doesn't mean that they themselves share the evaluation. Many times you can like something or not like something, and if the others do, you still can predict others to like them or not. But that is not always strictly related to your own evaluation. Like, I don't know, I say again, I like cherry tomatoes, and I go to a new community in which they hate cherry tomatoes. I know everybody will react disgusted seeing a cherry tomato. Do I change my evaluation of cherry tomatoes? Not necessarily. You see what I mean? Not necessarily. This is a further step. I mean, my own evaluation is still differentiated by theirs, but then I can use their evaluation to understand how to coordinate with them. If they invite me to dinner, I will not bring cherry tomatoes, right?
Yeah, no, I completely agree.
Okay, so
nothing I was saying goes against that. Yeah.
Okay,
I think it's in novel environments where you've never seen a cherry tomato.
Okay.
And other people are eating them, and they clearly know what cherry tomatoes are. Mm-hmm. So in a novel environment, you say, I know food. I've eaten food. I eat all the time. But in this environment, I don't know what this food is. Okay. So I'm deferring to them.
Okay.
Right on.
Yes. Still, maybe there might be some components of like the evaluation of the individual who is observing. I think it depends on the target. This is very contingent, right? Because maybe I don't fully understand why they don't like it or why they like it, but I would be still curious in private to try it out. It's different if I see that they react in such a way that makes me feel less poisonous. Let's say I'm in a novel environment and they're reacting to a specific type of mushroom, like, oh no, like we're not even going close to that. I don't think I'm gonna grab the mushroom and cook it or eat it, right? So I totally agree with you, but I think then it depends on the domain. Like, you have technical knowledge, you have natural responses, you have so many layers of culture and of values that I don't know. It would depend on the context, I would like to say.
Yeah, it depends on how novel the environment is for you, and then what the potential repercussion is for making a mistake. Mm-hmm. If you're operating a pen, there's very low stakes if somebody's operating a new type of writing implement, right? That's small. But if you're trying to operate heavy machinery, you could lose a limb. So there, the information is more relevant, right? And I think, like you found in your results, which is like we were talking about before with the saliency of negative cues, is negative displays are more salient to us than positive displays. If somebody's eating a mushroom and saying it's delicious, I might remember the mushroom, I might not. But if somebody eats the mushroom and then immediately dies, I'm definitely going to remember, okay, definitely don't eat that one. Maybe you can eat the one that somebody was happy about, but definitely don't eat the one that killed somebody.
Yeah. Absolutely agree that negative displays are more crucial for survival, so they're more relevant, definitely.
And so you referenced before like an overarching philosophical take. Do you want to dive into that a little?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I was saying, right, that one thing is acquiring values. Another thing is then integrating these values in our own take on the world and on ourselves. So in the future, I mean, I would like to expand on this and to really try to understand or to conceptualize how we can have a system of values, which then I think takes the form of propositional language, sometimes in the forms of beliefs, which influences how we represent ourselves within the world or within a certain community or in relation to others or to another person. Because I think that we build a very strong self of identity, of course, which is dependent of a narrative that we continuously tell us. So I really love this narration part. I find it extremely interesting, the way we create continuity from chaos and from a lot of emotional states, emotional situations, interactions with others, episodes in our life. We create this story of ourselves. But the question is, as every story, there are some values there. And we grow up this way. When we are kids, they tell us stories all the time. There's a good guy, a bad guy, something good, something bad. And this is narrative all the time. So I think this core system of values is driving how we narrate ourselves. And I would be very interested to learn more about this, because sometimes this influences our decision making even more than anything else. Like there are these moments in life when you have to make a big decision and you tend to make decisions that are coherent to the person you represent to yourselves. It's okay, I'm Thomas, I have these values, I feel this way, I want to be in line with these values, so because I want to be this type of person, I want to become this, I want to represent myself as becoming this. And then I make the decision also based on that. But is that really an authentic decision making based on real values or just on the representation of the values? I'm getting very philosophical here, but the idea is this. I mean, I want to know to which extent values drive our decision making and to which extent we really reappraise them constantly, to also and also how we reconstruct events to integrate them in the values we want to have, because no one is ever the bad guy in their story, right? And this is the interesting part of me. If you talk with people when they're having an argument, everybody has their own reasons. Like there is this principle of sufficient emotion to be the good guy. But why? It means that you reconstruct reality in a completely different way, even when you're missing some pieces of information. You're still narrating it in a different way. And every event is flexible in how you represent it. Some people are more honest than others in doing that. Some people care more about living an authentic life and saying, okay, no, it went this way. This was not in line with the values I want to have. I'm going to change. I'm going to change my approach. I know it. I will learn from this. Many other people, they just change how they represent events. And this, I think it's very interesting. So, yeah, it would be two aspects. How we do it and what is driving, in which direction we do it, which I think it depends also on the values we acquire from our environment. And so, yeah, the affective component here is super strong.
Yeah, I really feel that. I think that one of the core emotions or one of the core purposes, functions of something like remorse or regret, right, is to look at ourselves as being the party that made the mistake in a particular memory. And maybe we didn't have that interpretation of it at the time or even for a period of time after. But in reconciling a version of ourselves that we want to become, we then reevaluate our position in something. And I think that one of the core things here is the capacity for empathy, right? And the way that we engage with the world, which is taking into account the perspectives and the feelings and the states of others. And I think that a lot of people go through the world deeply feeling that, and there are a lot of people who go through the world shunning that. And for me, this is a core thing with not only how I engage with the world, but also I think that the part of me that generates the poetry, right? But then also how I seek people to engage with socially, and also the people that I want to work with. I don't want to work with, I don't even have on this podcast, right? Individuals that I feel don't engage with the world in an empathic way, right? And I think that there's a way to construct our social environments where this, in the way you're putting it, the value structure sort of aligns. And I think that for me, I don't know if this maps for you, but the way I make sense of the value structure or the set of social priors in the way how I define basically the same thing or describes the same thing is that some individuals look outward to understand their own behavior, right? And reconcile their behavior. And then some people just try to internally define this whole thing. And I find that entirely too individualistic, right? And I find that leads to a very different set of ethical structures.
Yeah, I would like to introduce in relation to this the notion of emotional coherence, right? We discussed about this a couple of times. Affective coherence maybe is even a better word. So the idea is you always need things to kind of make sense in your internal representation of the world. Then this is exactly what you were saying. Some people are more self-absorbed in a sense, so they tend to distort some of the events to make it fix inside this internal structure. Some people experience emotions because of the violation of their internal structure. And that is very, very, very important because it is what makes people actually grow and be more empathic towards the world, to open their mind and to become really themselves, because you don't need all the time to deny and to reject that you didn't react in the right way, or you made a bad choice, or that life is unfair, right? And there are many things happening, and even if when you don't want, you can hurt other people and be a jerk. Yeah, it happened to everybody, but the point is then to elaborate it within your system. Here we are going even a little bit farther than what I meant at the beginning, because this is but then the subjective experience within what is happening. But I really like the idea of this interpretation of the world, which is based on some of the values. So I think this also influences experience itself, like on a perceptual level. Your emotions do all the time, right? If you are in a bad mood, you tend to take others' words as being more negative than what they actually are. You see something bad where there is nothing going on. You can have arguments with your partner out of nowhere because they're just tired and you're grumpy. So emotions are there. And I think that there are many other like internal values that work in this way. They push and influence. I see ourselves as a mosaic of many internal worlds with many different emotions, and sometimes some of them prevail, and then we have to put them together and to find calm, and to sometimes you have to let them go also. Not every emotion is possible to elaborate, right? And this is also another important point, because you can also be you can observe yourself constantly within this process, but I don't think that's necessarily the best way to go, because there must be some balance between the two things. But going back to what I wanted to say, I don't know if you're familiar with Kuhn, Thomas Kuhn, the philosopher, no? Oh, well, basically the idea, he was trying to explain scientific progress, like his scientific communities, as depending also on a sort of a social component, which was how a certain historical moment shares a paradigm, like an interpretation of reality, which is radicating the beliefs that are belonging to that specific historical moment. I think we do the same in our everyday life. Like we have this system of values, this paradigm, like this window on reality, and everything that goes towards us has to be filtered by this. Not even filtered, it's how we encapsulate reality. And these internal values, they need this coherence, right? And then this is how we take data and information from what is out there. Again, I'm really speculating here. It's what I would like to do in next decades. Right?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that there's something analogous to like the Gestalt shift, but with the interpretation of information. So when you make what Kuhn would call a paradigmatic shift, which is you all of a sudden exists in a different narrative world, then it also necessitates a set of gestalts of different sets of interpretations of things which you were interpreting in a particular way before. I see A as A, but now I see A as B. What I thought was A, now I see it as having been B the entire time. And I think that that's an important way of means of reconciliation, right? Of a shift from one way of being to another way of being. All the reconciliations for the internal coherence end up with small gestalts of, oh yeah, I had thought I had behaved this way, but now I see myself behaving this way in this thing. And sometimes even just reconciling a way we felt about a thing and a narrative we were telling ourselves about that feeling versus keeping the feeling constant, but changing the narrative around it, right? And I think that that's a really important part. And there's something almost Quinean there, right? In that, like, this idea that our sets of values, our priors, belief structures need to have some kind of internal coherence, right? As they relate to one another, even if they're fractured into subcomponents, there needs to be some kind of coherence. And yeah, this sort of cognitive dissonance, which can exist, which we then attempt to reconcile, especially when it comes to affective states. I mean, do you have any response to that?
So what's the question?
I guess, like, do you see it as critically important also that the interpretations of our events maintain some kind of consistency as they come in, or do you see the reconciliation process as something that comes afterwards upon reflection?
Okay, I see. This is a very, very interesting point. I think this is somehow related to some conversations we had on conspiracy theories.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah, because I mean, there are these theories saying, okay, so system of beliefs, they are hierarchical in a sense. So, for example, people believing in conspiracy theories at the local level, they can have conflicting beliefs. Like, I don't know, if you believe in the conspiracy theory for Osama bin Laden, that it's not true that the US killed Osama bin Laden. They found in some empirical studies that people tend to assess as true both the statements Osama bin Laden is still alive and the statement Osama bin Laden was already dead when they say they killed him. Right? So, right. Dead or alive, the bin Laden of Schrödinger. And
Schrödinger's Laden.
And why? Because at a global level, at a global coherence, these are both compatible with the belief the government is lying to us. So there is coherence there, even when it seems there is not. And my personal take is the government is lying to us is not the axiom of this global structure. It is actually the affect state behind the propositional belief the government is lying to us. So I perceive chaos, I have this internal need for emotional coherence. I produce the beliefs, I project these on the government is lying to us. And this way, I build an internal structure that is coherent in which I feel, oh, I figured it out. All this chaos is somehow controlled now, and I don't deal with this. This is an example of changing the perception of the world, of changing my representation of the world based on my inner feelings, on my affective values. And I think this happens a lot. Of course, I think we can all agree.
Yeah. So the motivation here is kind of reconcile with our own discomfort in our internal world.
Mm-hmm.
That's the...
And also, without admitting to myself that I'm not able to understand a very complex system like the world, that is unpredictable. People have aversion for what is unpredictable. They always try to find agency, attributions, and to understand what's going on by keeping it in an order structure. Dealing with chaos is the most difficult thing we can do when we just want to balance our emotions. We're like, okay, I let it go. I know it's something I can't explain to myself totally.
Yeah, there's the literature base that I'm coming from looks at it as illusory pattern perception to mitigate uncertainties. So there's good evidence showing that the more uncertainty we feel, the more we rely on constructing patterns as a sense-making protocol. And yeah, there is so much that we can't understand about the functioning of the world because it is incredibly complex. But the more uncertain we feel, the more we also feel the need to understand and make sense of the world. So it's much easier to say, I'm uncertain about so many things, and also I understand how the world is going. So somehow the uncertainties that I feel at a small scale are mitigated. The feelings are mitigated by the fact that I understand what's going on. And I think that this also, say, the purpose of higher order religious structures, right? The need for meaning in the universe at all, the meaning for order in the universe. I think that a lot of these things come about from the desire, the like deep ingrained, not like an active reflection on it, but the deep desire to have something like a sense of understanding, even if not control, a sense of, my God has a plan. Even if I don't have access to it, there is a plan out there. And that sort of serves as a tool of pacification. And I think even if the God is an angry God, like in the case of, this government is lying to us, that functions as an angry God, in that there's meaning and purpose. It's just that meaning and purpose is against me. It's still easier to deal with somehow than the uncertainty.
Yeah, and going back to your question, because, I didn't actually address it. So we were saying, this is a component, but I think that these are two different things. Like one thing is how I take in information. So the examples were made based on my emotions or my evaluations of the environment. I have a perception is more or less negative, more or less accurate of what is going on. I don't like the word accuracy because I think everything is subjective. So I don't have the term of comparison what it really is, but in relation to others. And another thing is a narrative of the world and me inside the world. So I really believe that we always represent in relation to something, right? And we represent ourselves in relation to the world. So yes, our experience, our perceptual experience, also in how we compute information, is influenced by our core affective system. Of course, biologically, it's what happens. But then I think how we integrate this in our narration of the environment, that is where you can have multiple outcomes. Either I don't need, this affective state is not so chaotic and strong that drives completely my narration of the environment. So I don't have to say, the government is lying to us. I just experience emotions and I have just this first level, but not the second one. Or maybe I channel it in a different way, which is not so strong. Some people, one thing is believing in conspiracy theories. There is also this need for being part of a community in that. So I feel alone, I have this strong emotional state, world is chaotic. If I believe in this and I see that other people respond to it with me because I'm in relation to others as well, we don't have to forget about this. We are social animals all the time. So if I see everybody, I go at the bar, I don't know, and I say, oh man, this is a lie on the news, it's bullshit. Everybody's like, yeah. I already have a small group. Better than being home alone, feeling bad about myself. So that's the easy way. So I have myself, so my internal emotions, which influence my perception of things. This is as an influence on how I narrate reality in the sense of a narration of me in relation to the world. So all the available information, especially now with internet and everything. And then there is myself in relation to others. Of course, these two last aspects are connected because I want to... I think this is what happens in a sense, that I have these multiple layers of interpretation and of narrative of reality, because then I have also narrative about my own self, of what I want to be. And many people, for example, who believe in conspiracy theories, they have a high opinion of themselves. They figured it out. They're geniuses for some reason. And... But this is important because it covers all the three aspects, no? I explain the world, I find sense of community in relation to others, I find peace with myself. Boom. And internal model, you feel better, of course, than not doing this.
Yeah, and conspiracy theories are as old as, right, there's evidence as old as written language. But the interesting sort of byproduct of the internet is that people can find conspiracy theories to buy into, but also conspiracy theory communities more easily than any other time in history. And so while we hoped at the beginning that the internet would help dispel misinformation and conspiratorial ideation, in fact, it helped inspire it. And in as many people as the internet is able to inform and satisfy the curiosities of, it's also able to sort of feed the flames of conspiratorial ideation and radical groups.
Yeah, or in a milder way, you can have a very spiritual approach to the world, and you create a narrative of yourself being in touch with that divine entity. That is also something that helps people in a different way. And then you find like all this chaos, or like also to explain what happens in the world, right? It's also sometimes, if you ask to a religious person, okay, but if there is a God, how do you explain all these wars and sufferance and pain? It's always coherent with the idea that God has a plan, as you were saying, if I don't understand it. So I just project all these bad emotions somewhere else. I don't admit them to myself, in a sense. And that is okay. And then, I mean, of course, but... yeah.
So we're coming up at an hour and 20. Mm-hmm. Are there any other topics that you'd like to cover? Or, I mean, you already touched on also the sort of how you see the long-term trajectory of your research. But are there any other components of that you'd like to add?
I mean, I don't know. It's as I was telling you now, we're gonna continue with these studies on acquisition of values through effective observation of others and understanding a very low-level processing to acquire cultural information. And also we're gonna work with some unfamiliar objects now. I will go to work as a visiting researcher in the next months in the UK. So we're going to develop a project there based on how it changes decision-making processes and attitudes towards unfamiliar objects. So this is connected to what we were discussing. And after that, we go on with these developmental studies, and then it would be nice to expand. I'm just summarizing a bit also in my mind if I missed something, but I think we covered most of the future trajectories.
Yeah. And what is the thing like driving you in this research?
Well, many things, but of course, I mean, I've always been very curious. I've always been observing what's going on around me. I've always been wondering what goes on in the mind. What is this black box that is our mind? How do I go from feeling bad to feeling good? How do I go from liking someone to not liking them? Or to feeling confident about myself or not? And this whole cognition, behavior, emotions, all these things come together. How do I learn about things? And also this narrative component. I mean, I did my bachelor in philosophy, so I started from a very theoretical perspective. And then I had a switching, which I really wanted to understand what is going on in the mind, right? So I did my master's in cognitive science, which had too many integrative models of human evolution, neuroscience, having a better understanding of scientific components of a scientific approach to the components of the mind, also animals and stuff. And during the PhD, it's really the possibility to expand on the available knowledge and to really go in a direction that is new. And I really like it because it's like an adventure. You don't know what you're going to find. You have these open questions. They're extremely interesting and they're everywhere. What I really love about my topic of the research, if now, after this podcast, I take the tram, I see affective observation going on the tram. I see kids looking at parents. I see people trying to understand which button they have to push to get off the tram. And it's everywhere all the time. And we do it and we don't know it and we coordinate. And it's amazing. So interest, curiosity, also the idea of contributing to something meaningful, which is very important. Of course, all these things, and while doing so, trying to stay true to my own values, in which I really want to keep this balance between the experimental approach, the scientific part, and the theoretical interpretation of the findings, and also sometimes to stay a little bit in the clouds. I like that. Then you say it's an empirical question. We're gonna see, but I think this process is important, and I'm really happy about the people I'm working with, Ohan included, of course, but also I mean these people from Switzerland, these people from Oxford, these people from CU. Everybody is amazing, and I think it's a perfect mix of time that we spend on like being very, very pragmatic and structured about experiments, controlling things, making like good qualitative, quantitative research. And on the other side, staying in the clouds and just having fun, talking about all these things. And then you say, oh, we should test this. And you do it, it doesn't work. Fine. You say the clouds part is probably the one I'm really in love with. Yeah.
One last question. So how do you see your research in line with this applied science? So what's the implication of your research in the society or the real world? I don't know, that's a bit abstract, but how do we do, because I think cognitive science in our department, we do a lot of experiment, we have our own theoretical background and some frameworks, some models, even we come up with by ourselves. But how do we integrate this, all the things we've done, the research, how do we integrate with the real society or the real people, not in the academia world? I think it might be too general, but just want to...
Oh, no, it's not general at all. I think, of course, when we run these experiments, we're not thinking, oh, how can we apply the findings to something that is in the real world? I still struggle with this, what is the real world? I don't know. I think nothing is real. People lie to themselves all the time. We are just living a built narration of everything. So in a sense, it's not very different from all the theoretical background we develop here, but stay more concrete and less in the clouds. Of course, I think these in the long term can have an impact on society because it can help us to understand how people really become parts of new groups and communities, how information spreads. And this is also interesting if we consider that the future will involve a lot of interaction with technology and AI everywhere, because this emotional component, and many studies will have to be done about user interaction and emotions in the context of interacting with artificial systems. I think this is also very, very interesting, and also in relation to generalization, like the ability to go, because this is one of the biggest mysteries, right? How do we generalize? How can we create artificial systems that are able to generalize? Oh, I'm being very general because your question was general, of course. But I think that these are a lot of pieces of a big puzzle. So I'm not telling you my specific research will have this strong impact in the world, but I think that this rise of affectivism, as it's been described in a paper published 2 years ago, in which we are entering a new era of research, which puts emotions, emotional displays at the center of explaining humans' decision-making processing, acquisition of information. I think it will have a huge impact on many, many aspects of how we relate to our world and how we're going to develop also artificial systems which are able to interact with people as we actually do, and to understand what is our systems of values, what are our expectations and predictions, not only in relation to technology, of course. I mean, this is one of the many aspects, but I mean, in our globalized world, we all the time have to do with integration of different cultures, and the emotional component has been a little bit overlooked, in my opinion. And now, I mean, there will be other 100 things that, I mean, even just to understand better spread of information, conspiracy theories in a world in which information is available to everyone all the time. I mean, you see, I think it's everywhere for real. Then I don't plan on like trying to instrumentalize my empirical findings into something, because I'm not that guy. I'm more the guy who is here to try to do some research and understand what's going on. But yeah, you never know.
Amazing. Yeah, I think that there are also huge implications for understanding how we use AI as learning tools, right? And the things that we lose out on when there is no affective response in the learning. And we need to sort of rely on intrinsic curiosity generated by AI if we're using AI as a learning tool. And I think that there's a really important thing that we shouldn't miss there, particularly in children.
Yeah, particularly in children.
Yeah, right on. Well, thank you so much. I mean, for all the answers, especially I feel like the last two were particularly beautiful. So great. Thankful to end on that note.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I mean, it's been great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.